Max. Welcome back to part two with Dave Osborne. He is a director of 2D and 3D and known for his amazing animation all around the world. And currently, he has just finished Lego's Nexo Knights and Mr. Bean, and he's got a project coming up with Netflix. So let's welcome David back. Hi, Dave.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be back.
Yeah, and we are recording live.
How are we all doing?
Yeah, we're recording live with Dave. Dave, can you let everyone know where you're coming live from today?
Yeah, I'm coming live from London in the UK, and it's been a lovely sunny day here today for once.
Yeah, and so Dave works in animation, and he was letting us know in part one when he was a little boy. Your father, you said, worked at a milk dairy farm, was it?
It was a dairy. It was a dairy, bottling milk.
Okay, so he was bottling milk, and you would have these every year. They would have these. Was it a company picnic, or you said where they had the projection?
It was a Christmas party for the kids. It was all for the kids of the employees, and what would happen is that they would sort of, we'd have the various things, the jelly and ice cream, and all of the sort of things that you tend to have in the UK for parties for kids. And then we would have a film show before they brought in Santa Claus. And my earliest experience of animation was watching Tom and Jerry's, on a screen being projected by a 16mm projector, and it's what got me hooked into animation.
Yeah. So at your father's Christmas party where all the kids and all your friends got to go, your brother, did you have brothers and sisters too?
Yeah, my brother and sister are quite a bit older than me, so they sort of left home by that point. I think they didn't really want much to do, their little brother. But no, I mean, they were much older than me, so I sort of, in a way, it's probably why I ended up with the animation side of things, because it was something I occupied myself a little bit. I didn't have any siblings around; they'd sort of left home, and if you're interested in drawing and whatever, it's a kind of, I suppose it's an individual thing. It's a self-contained thing to a certain extent, which is probably why it sort of fulfilled my needs at that time,
Yeah, you're watching Tom and Jerry, you're eating ice cream and cake, and then you're finding your love for this. So I want to ask you, was there a favorite film growing up? Also, like I know Tom and Jerry, you fell in love with at this office party at your dad's company, but was there any films that you went to as well that you just fell in love with?
I suppose, like most kids in those days, I was taken to the cinema, and at that point, the films really the only animated films that came to the cinema were the Disney ones. And of course, we're talking really the sort of Disney classic ones like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but the one I remember being taken to probably quite young again, and I actually have to confess there, it was my sister who took me, was Jungle Book. And again, it was one of those things, seeing again, as we talked about in part one, we mentioned, the world was black and white, television was black and white for me in those days. You go to a cinema and the thing is, so brightly colored. It's an overload. It's like giving a kid, a lot of colors.
So we're recording live, so let me just see if we get Dave back. So he's talking about he went to Disney at the cinema as a little kid with his sister. And I've just, we lost your sound a little bit. So you were at the cinema with your sister going to Jungle Book. And back then we had black and white TV. So this color was a sensory overload, but such a beautiful world that captivated you.
Yeah. And I think with a film like Jungle Book, I was in, the wonderful, one thing it's just got incredible music. And I think it's probably got some of the best animation that was done, that the Nine Old Men ever did, so, the drawing and the work of Baloo the bear and Mowgli. And so again, I think it was just charming. It was entertaining. It was, there was a story there as a child I obviously could engage with, which was obviously this young Mowgli character sort of trying to work his way out and where he is in the world, which is exactly what all of us are doing at that age. So yeah, I think that was a sort of big influence at that point. And I think growing up as I got older, I was still into the Disney films, but I think I think it was the short subjects. It was things like the Tom and Jerry still that stayed with me. It was the comedy. You know, as I began to understand the whole sort of short subject world, you know, in the early 80s and whatever, as I headed towards college, I got into as well. I think I got into things like Tex Avery, and that sort of kind of totally, you know, zany animation that was done there for those sort of films. And, you know, that sort of broke so many boundaries in that sense, in terms of what you could do to a kind of character, stretching it and distorting it, and the worlds that were created. So I think, in a way, you know, I'm reflecting back. There's quite a few influences I've got as a creator, as a director, and I think, you know, certainly the Tom and Jerry's were one, and you know, but equally, I think watching some of the silent movie films that were, you know, both, you know, when I, you know, my father's you know, Christmas party thing, and also they were put on television in those days. They were still showing them widely on television, like the Laurel and Hardy and the Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton films, you know, and that broad humour. I liked that. But I liked also the more sensitive storytelling, you know, the things that you found in Jungle Book, and then even when I got a little bit older, as it goes, you know, and you come across things like Akira, and you know, the sort of Japanese films and things like that. And so I think, you know, I wouldn't say there's one film that drove me as a creator and a director and a storyteller. I think ultimately there's quite a few that have driven me. You know, one of the areas that I ended up working in, which I really enjoyed, was working on Mr. Bean, which is, you know, the character created by Rowan Atkinson. I mean, he originally created it as a live action character in the 1990s, early 1990s, and I think it was last year. I think it's been going for 30 years. Which is quite something when you think about it, that this character has lasted this long. And
30 years. That's a long
30
time.
years, yeah. Yeah, I don't know whether he'll do any more live action, but I think certainly, you know, they've done quite a bit of the animation ones and whatever. And it's one of the highest subscriber YouTube channels out there. I think it's got something like 20 million subscribers to the Mr. Bean channel. It's huge. You know, and my experience of working with that, you know, one of the things that I found myself when I was given the opportunity to direct some of those, you know, I looked at what Rowan as a creator had done, you know, and obviously looking at the live action ones and some of the earlier animated films that they'd made. But I also looked at what influenced him. And I know that one of the characters and one of the actors and performers that influenced him heavily was Jacques Tati, the French director and performer. And that was, although I'd watched his films, and I'd certainly watched, you know, Mission Hula Hoo's Holiday, which is the famous one, and I think probably you know, some listeners might have heard of at least, or perhaps you know, come across it at some point. You know, I think one of the great things about all of these things is watching somebody's craft, and having watched a lot of Rowan's craft on his live action work. Then to go and watch what influenced him and Jacques Tati's craft, I think was really interesting for me, and it sort of, I think it helped me get into what I needed to do with that character, and help, you know, the run of episodes. I did 26 of them, and finding my route into them, because I know that, you know, lots of other people have made some already, and you know, you always want to think, well, what am I going to do that's different? And at the same point, people don't want different. What they want is more of the same, but you kind of got to find something else there to sort of give it a little bit more. And I think, you know, looking about how Tati worked and whatever, and I found I rediscovered some of the stuff that as a child that I'd enjoyed. I sort of went back and looked at Buster Keaton again, and that wild and big physical comedy that he did. And again, I found this time around I had a much better appreciation of him, both as a performer, director, and ultimately a creator. And I think the way he crafted his films. And I think anybody starting out, I don't think it's a bad place to go and look, is to go and have a look at some of those silent films again. You know, they are there on YouTube, and you can find them quite easily. I think, you know, I think there's a lot that's dated about them, and, you know, obviously some of the moral attitudes are dated and not correct. But equally, I think the filmmaking and the storytelling, I think there are things in there about how they think and about how they're created and communicated with the audience. I think it certainly for somebody involved in animation, there's still value there to be had, and still something to take in. But doing something like Mr. Bean, I mean, we worked, obviously for us it was a script-driven show, because that was how Rowan had worked and created the other ones, the original ones, and so we worked very heavily with the script and made sure that those felt tight and that the comedy was there. But I still felt I had the opportunity to go into the script and lift things, and that was one of the great pleasure of finding things and just being able to lift out the comedy and whatever. And a character like Mr. Bean is quite carefully constructed. He doesn't naturally sit in a cartoon world. He doesn't sit naturally in he isn't Tex Avery's, one of Tex Avery's cartoon characters. His eyes don't bulge when he's shocked or anything like that. He's quite real. His reactions are relatively real in how he responds to situations. A lot of it is what's going on in the head. And when you watch Rowan Atkinson as a performer, I think that's so much about him as a performer, whether it's in Mr. Bean or Blackadder or anything he does. In fact, I think that there's a lot of what his presence on is thinking on screen, and that was something I wanted to get back to. I wanted to find that in our animated version. I wanted to pull that into it as well. Getting him to have the time on screen so he was thinking, and that the audience could see that, because you can sort of see it in his face where he's working things out. He's always got this little scheme that he's trying to resolve a problem that he's created, and it's a lot of it is about how allowing the audience to enjoy the moment of him thinking before all of these things happen, that eventually the pratfall happens, before the thing that happens that actually causes the big physical moment that quite often takes place. It's getting to those, it's that journey to that point that I think is quite interesting, as both as a director and also watching somebody like him perform, so that was something I was very conscious on the ones that I helped work on and write, direct and bits and pieces. So one of the things I found as well was that I looked at these big physical bits that we wanted to do sometimes with Mr. Bean, and I found that to make it believable, one of the tricks I found, and also to convince my audience, which is often my producers and my and Rowan Atkinson was an exec producer on the show, was to actually act it out. So one of the things that we had at one point was he was in a tunnel, in an under tunnel, and he falls forward, and he kind of holds himself in position, and he's almost horizontal. He's not quite horizontal, but he's almost horizontal, and then something's happened behind him. That's what's made him fall, and that's fine. But then there was a moment where he had to get himself up and back up on this ledge again, and I went outside, and I was working at home that particular day, and I found the two walls that were about the right distance, and I literally tried it a couple of times about how I would do it, and eventually I worked out what the acting and the performance would be in order to do that, and then that's what we boarded. And then when we came to record Rowan Atkinson to create the voices, that's what I described to him. I was able to describe to him what the physicality of the process was that he needed to do, and then he was able to engage with that as a performer. And because often when you're in a voice recording booth, you can't suddenly move around very frantically. You have to be careful not to sort of knock the microphone or whatever, and you can't wave your arms around too much because it creates air and stuff around the mic and stuff. So you have to contain yourself. So for him and myself to that was how I worked it out, and how sort of helped to explain it. And I found that quite a useful process to actually do those sort of things. And it sort of eventually led to me hanging off my shed roof one day when I realised I had the character hanging. Oh, he's got to hang off the roof. I know. I'll climb up on my roof and I'll see what that feels like. And then I kind of realized, well, this is possibly getting a little bit dangerous. But, again, it was that experience. And I suppose that goes back to me also being an animator. And I always felt as an animator, when I was, originally was a drawn animator, I always had to act something out to understand how to get it onto paper. I always had to walk around. I always had to wave my arms around as whatever character it was. If I was being a dog or something like that, I'd get down on the floor and I'd suddenly start performing like the dog should do if it had to be, because I wanted to feel. I had to feel it in my body to understand what the movement was. So that I could actually transcribe that onto paper or, give that instruction to somebody else. So that's certainly, and I still do that. I still, I can suddenly find myself jumping up in front of my monitor at the moment, talking to a storyboard artist and say, no, like this, I need it to look like this, or do, and I'm waving my arms around and whatever. And I'm not sure how much they're getting at this point on Zoom or Google Meet or whatever it is, but I believe I'm communicating it at that point.
So live action is really like the. Do you have any tips as a director for live action? How you have to execute, like you said, like the communication and the physicality, explaining to the crew and the cast.
I certainly like to, if in normal circumstances, when when we can all meet in a room and work together, which I think certainly as a director and as a creative person, I think it's a healthier world to be in, because you communicate in a much better way. I like to talk through, if I'm briefing in an episode to the animators, I like to show the animatic, which is I spend a lot of time with the animatic. It's my most important working tool. I think, I try to get everything, all the timing as right as I possibly can. I try to get the posing where I want it so that I think it communicates the best it possibly can to layout and to the animators and to everybody else in the process beyond. But I still like using that. And then, depending on how much time we've got, I will still walk through this episode and I will act bits out. I will talk it through. I might try and show something. I think these days with the world of YouTube, everybody tends to use reference clips and whatever. I find myself these days as well, especially in the sort of action adventure world that I'm in a little bit at the moment, I tend to like to use little bits of pre-visualization work. We quite often, on the show that I'm currently working on, we quite often sort of use temporary models of sets, and I quite find that quite useful to be able to sort of like work out staging sometimes, and maybe shoot the odd thing. I mean, I'll sometimes make something here and just get my iPhone and do something. And last year I was working on a show, and I wanted this thing where I had a dog's point of view running around the lounge in a manic way in this sort of comic scene. I literally thought, okay, how do I explain this to storyboard? And I got my iPhone and I literally pretended to be the dog. I got around and I shot it as this point of view thing and jumped up onto the sofa, and the dog gets hold of the cushion. And so I did that and threw it out and tossed it around and whatever and things like that. And I think that helps communicate well, things like that, because it can be quite a difficult thing to transcribe those sort of ideas sometimes. Also for the storyboard artist to actually think, how on earth do I visualize that, So I think, those tools, I think, that sort of thing. I think, I'm careful about, when I start working on a project, what I watch. I'm careful about what I read as well. I find that when I'm working on a series, it's quite difficult to read novels for pleasure. I think it's quite often, because I'm carrying, so many episodes in my head, the storylines are so many episodes in my head. It's not that I get confused, it's I find myself, there's a little bits of influence coming into things sometimes. I think, okay, I don't want that influence, so I need to set that aside. So I'm quite careful. I don't necessarily read, when I'm working on scripting in particular with the writers and stuff, I don't tend to read a novel. Partly because I'm also reading so many scripts. and there's only so much you can read during one day. But and I'm also careful about what I watch, because I can think, you can spiral sometimes. Everybody says, "Oh, watch this or watch that," and you watch these things, and suddenly you think, "I've seen this shot somewhere before. Oh yes, it was what I watched last week." I think that it's right to have influence, and that's why, like doing the Bean stuff, I took the step back to look at what had influenced, the creators or whatever Bean. And I think that's probably, for me, it's not right for everybody, but I think for me that was the right way to do it.
Yeah, it's like on my kids' podcast, Enchanting book reads. I try not to watch anything because I create original stories for kids every week, and I just create on my own, and I don't watch any. I don't really have time to watch anything else, because when you're creating a show a week for almost 2 years, that's global, that's hit #1 around the world, it's I have kids waiting for new stories. So I'm just so busy. I don't have to, like you said, don't even have time to read a novel or watch anything, especially if you're a creator. But I love how you're a director, hands-on. You're like, you do the physicality, because a lot of people are like, they love directing tips. Animation is so huge right now. There's like adult animation, there's anime animation, there's kids animation, and they're like, is it preschool? What grades? But you've got to work on the most iconic things, like 30 years, Mr. Bean, and comedy. I was going to ask you to do comedy. It's really hard to do where it comes across funny. That's like a very special skill, especially in live action or anything, that comedy and directing comedy and get it where it's funny on the screen for 30 years. That's amazing. Congratulations.
Well, I certainly didn't do it for 30 years with Mr. Bean, but I did my little portion of some of the animated ones. Yeah. I think comedy is very difficult, and comedy is also taste. I mean, it's that's the thing that some people probably don't like Mr. Bean. Some people like verbal comedy. They like sharp dialogue. But I think with something like I think with a kind of program like Mr. Bean, I think one of the things I realized very early on when I was working on it, and seeing, in those days, YouTube would put the comments up for the clips and stuff like that. I think they've stopped all of that now, but, you would read it and you realize the impact it was having on kids, not just in the United States or in Europe, but in India, in places like Thailand. And you would read these clips and they would just adore this character. They just loved the character. And I suppose he was a grown-up. I think at the basis of it, he was a grown-up man who acted like a child. Yeah, and they identified with it. And it's a simple premise in a way, and that's the beauty of it. And I think that's a lot to do with comedy. I think it has to have, at the end of it, it has to be quite a simple sort of thing about it, and a lot of that early, visual comedy, like with people like Buster Keaton, whatever, it was kind of a very simple premise, actually sort of create that. It's interesting. I mean, comic taste, and I work, the show I'm doing at the moment has got, it has comedy in it. Some of it's verbal, some of it's physical, some of it's, I would describe it as being more character based. And so you are always looking at it and thinking, right, okay, am I doing enough with this moment? Have I got something I can pull out of this at this point? Sometimes it might be think, oh, if you only just looked at camera at this moment, or or just looked a little bit longer, you might get the audience to get that thought or that kind of comic idea across. And so, yeah, for me, it's something that's always there. I mean, animation, as a medium, its heart is comedy, I would say. It's storytelling, of course, but I think for a lot of people, when it boils down to it, they want it to make them feel good and to make them laugh and whatever. So I think it's a big part of it. It's a kids as an audience, you're doing storytelling for kids and whatever. It's a difficult audience as well, because they change rapidly. Your 6-year-old is into one thing, and then 3 months later, the mind's changed. They've grown up a little bit. Somebody at school has introduced them to something else, a bit older orientated. and they've leapt. Suddenly they've left behind one world and leapt into another world. And cognitively, I think, for me as a director, again, I would say, children as an audience, I think are really a kind of quite a tough audience, because what works for what works for a 5-year-old doesn't work quite the same way for a 6, 7, or 8-year-old sometimes. And the change can happen, and and animation itself is a very difficult technical medium, so it's a challenge. It's a challenge directing animation. Yeah.
Can you? I know you worked on the Legos Nexos nights, and you're working on this amazing new project with Netflix. Is there anything you want to share with us? You can tell us anything at all to give us any little hints.
Okay, all right. So the show I'm working on now is a comedy action adventure show. It's based on 4 superheroes, and these 4 superheroes are from Africa, and they're 4 superhero girls, and they're fantastic, these characters. They've been the studio I'm working with is based in South Africa, and the stories themselves are based in Lusaka, which is in Zambia, which is in the southern part of the southern part of continent Africa. And the stories are around, there's some African themes in there. It's to do with power, political power, but also, which is, kind of expressed in a way that's appropriate for children, that they can understand, that somebody wants to control the city. Just as you might do in a Batman series or whatever. But there's also some themes in there which are very much to do with kids growing up in Africa. The kids themselves have got backgrounds and family dynamics that reflect how things are in Africa, which is different ultimately. But yeah, so maybe. We can sort of talk a little bit more about that at some other point. But I think as a show, it's going to be really exciting. I'm really enjoying making it at the moment, and we have a fantastic crew in South Africa and a fantastic crew in Paris, and a great crew in London. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. That'll be out next year.
Oh, nice. And Dave, do you have a website or where anyone can keep up with when it's how they can keep up with you or your projects?
I do have a website. I don't generally keep any of my projects up. They can certainly go and have a look at what I've made in the past, and that's called it's www.zestanimationlimited.com. And Zest Animation is my own little company that I use.
Oh, great. And is there social media or anything that you want them to see what you're working on or what's coming up?
I don't have anything like that, I'm afraid. No. I don't. I probably should. You've exposed my weakness now, but I probably should, but I don't.
I like most of the creatives here are like social media on top of being a creator, and you're directing, and there's just so many things. But we just wanted to say, we're so happy you came on the show to tell us about your incredible journey from watching that film from Tom and Jerry with your dad's office party to working on animation and becoming this fantastic director. Like I said, comedy is so hard to pull visually. You can write comedy, you can do stand-up comedy, but to have it work visually too, it's very hard. And you've done some of the most iconic, most wonderful animation content. And we're just wishing you and saying good luck on your new project with Netflix. Congratulations. And we're excited for have you come back and tell us about more stuff that you're working on. Thanks so much for coming on the show today, Dave.
Thanks very much for your time. It's been great. Really enjoyed talking about it. Thanks very much.
Yeah, and thanks for listening. And make sure you check out part 1 and part 2 with Dave Osborne. Really, David Osborne, but his name we spoke about is Dave. And he's an incredible director, an animation director in 2D and 3D. And he's amazing projects coming up. And thank you so much for listening, everyone. Have a great day. And do check out the summary and our podcast. You'll get all the descriptions and links to our amazing new things. And thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great day.